Yes. But I do have an indictment of some of the strategy. And again, the people that said Joe Biden was the problem. Where's my camera?
He was not the solution.
Okay, I will just note that it is probably not the best idea that Democrats orchestrated a very public stab fest, a proverbial stabbing in the front of the sitting president of the United States of America, and they didn't use him in his hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Right on. Go ahead. Simone Sanders, having some feelings about that. And look, she is not the only Democrat that has been heavily emoting on camera. Republicans have been righteously smug. But I'm putting in righteous because on some level, their guy won, their theory of the case won. And, for the most part, for all intents and purposes, the last few weeks, Democrats have been running around calling them Nazis, calling them garbage, have basically called Donald Trump Hitler. All of these things. They said he was a sexual abuser. They say he was misogynistic. They ran the gambit, and yet they lost to that guy. And so trying to do a bit of soul searching is not necessarily coming back with this idea that they did anything wrong. They're coming back mostly to the conclusion that people were just racist and misogynistic, and it is difficult for a woman to win, and her campaign was fundamentally flawless. That's what they've come up with. But on top of that, though, they're also trading blame. Basically, whose fault was it that the result ended up the way that it ended up? And that's what I want to get to. I assume that at some point there's going to be a finger pointing, and that finger pointing has already started. The Biden administration and the Harris administration are trading shots at one another in regards to who they think is more responsible for it. And I want to go through this article in order to discuss it. Welcome to The Thomas Show. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Jamal Thomas Show. It is not the morning, so I can't necessarily call it the morning show, but I would call it the Jamal Thomas Show. I'm not going to keep this long. I just wanted to point to this kind of finger pointing that's taken place. What I would honestly have wanted was some level of honest introspection and how on earth they failed so bad. If Donald Trump is indeed what they say Donald Trump is, a sexual abuser, a deviant, a fascist, he is apparently the end of all American democracy. He, what else? I mean, add your adjectives. Hitler, his people are garbage, his people are Nazis, etc., etc., etc. And yet, that guy didn't just win, that guy won in a landslide. Now, the problem with going with this particular type of analysis and following that up with, and Harris ran a flawless campaign, that it allows you to be in this kind of cynical distance from any kind of error or fault that might have taken place either in the Harris campaign or the Biden administration. Now, what I would say is, if you're looking for an honest assessment, the honest assessment would be in three fronts. Biden's fault, Harris' fault, Democratic Party's fault. And the reason why I say that is because from my point of view, each share some level of the blame. The truth is that even after Kamala Harris got into the race, even with the truncated schedule, she had time and she started off in the lead, or at the very least in a position where the polls were pretty much, it could break either way. The Biden administration did her no favors by not getting out of the race. So there is that. And what I mean by that is for Joe Biden to say he was a transitional president and then not get out the race. Okay, well, that's kind of problematic, right? You're an 80-something-year-old man. You're not necessarily in the best of cognitive or, for that matter, physical health. And you're telling people that you're going to run in a race. You get in a debate and you get crushed, not just crushed. It is cataclysmic in how bad that debate performance was. You get out, Kamala Harris gets in, and she's thrust into the spotlight out of the blue, when a week before, everybody thought she was completely unlikable and incapable of running in the race. Meaning, this was a fuckfest all the way through. What's interesting, though, is that they're trading blame, not necessarily trying to come to some kind of real political analysis of how did they fail so badly. How did a blue-collared billionaire, in the way that he characterizes himself, how did he take the position of being a fighter and defender of the working class against a Democratic Party that was the party of unions? That is something that they need to figure out, and they need to, kind of have some kind of honest assessment about. That honest assessment does not seem to be taking place anytime soon. And you get people like Joy-Ann Reid saying stuff like the following.
Time and experienced this country's history and knows it, cannot have believed that it would be easy. And I think it's important to say that, anyone who has experienced or been in the United States for any period of time and experienced this country's history and knows it cannot have believed that it would be easy to elect a woman president, let alone a woman of color. Let's just be clear. And nothing that was true yesterday about how flawlessly this campaign was run is not true now. I mean, this really was an historic, flawlessly run campaign. She had Queen.
This was a historic and flawlessly run campaign. Not any sign of flaw, defect, failure, or mistake. It was spotless. She even had Queen Latifah doing her dance and singing, and Queen Latifah doesn't dance and sing for pretty much anybody. She had Queen Latifah. So clearly, she should have won. And by definition of Queen Latifah and Taylor Swift, it was clearly flawless. Okay, this is outlandish. And again, it takes a certain amount of cynical distance from what actually happened. So instead of coming to some kind of assessment of, okay, what did we do wrong? How do we screw this up? If Donald Trump is what we say he is, how did we lose this race to him? If we are indeed the party that is representing the middle class, how did the middle class end up voting for him? These are questions that I would prefer, as opposed to, we did everything right. The issue is the American public, which is what she just said. Now, Simone Sanders and her, they do have something in common in the sense that this is Democrats talking to themselves about what happened and trying to digest the fact that they got crushed in a landslide victory. The last time a Republican won the popular vote was 2004? And the last time when Joe Biden ran, or when Hillary Clinton lost to Trump, she still had 4 million more votes. Donald Trump was even making gains in places like New York, which is a totally blue state. The Democratic Party needs to be able to answer that. And it is not the most satisfying thing in the world, I would imagine, for run-of-the-mill Democrats to listen to these talking heads come to the assessment that no, we did everything right. We were perfect. The only issue is that this racist, sexist American public that just wouldn't vote for a black woman even when she did everything right. Okay, that's one hypothesis. I don't necessarily ascribe to that one. Axios is reporting the popping off back and forth between the Harris campaign and the Biden campaign. And it sounds like Harris and her campaign are a little salty. Now, a lot of the salt is coming in, and she's not entirely wrong on this, but I want to give a little more context to it. Their point is Joe Biden said he was a transitional candidate. If he was indeed a transitional candidate, he should have ran once, got out the race, called it a day. Now, whether Harris realizes it or not, if Joe Biden did that, then Kamala Harris would have had to go through a primary process. And in that primary process, Kamala Harris would have needed to win a primary process. And if you remember the last time Kamala Harris went through a primary, she could not even make it to Iowa. Meaning, even back then, she was not the most likable person in the world. She could not even get the black vote running through a primary as a black candidate. The point that I'm making here is this argument that Joe Biden should have just remained a transitional candidate doesn't necessarily mean that she would have ended up being the standard bearer in the way that she ended up being the standard bearer. But by the same token, if he was a transitional candidate, he should have called it a day. He was not necessarily in the best of shape. And to back up a point a little bit more, if you remember, when Joe Biden finally flamed out, Harris had all of what, 2-3 months in order to wage a campaign? And you had basically a motley crew of people who were part Biden, part Harris, all kind of jumbled in together. They had to figure out what they were going to do, how they were going to run, what they were going to run on, meaning the theme of their campaign. All of that stuff needed to be done kind of on the fly because Joe Biden flamed out. Now, on top of that, a primary process and a contentious primary process is not a negative. Now, I know Democrats often consider it to be somewhat of a negative. It is not a negative. When you have a primary process, a healthy primary process, where political candidates are on stage fighting each other, for all intents and purposes, they're not going to be saying anything that radically different. I mean, you're not going to have one Democrat saying we need to give, Medicare for all, and another Democrat saying you need to take health care away. That would be super bizarre. What most likely you get is this kind of body of ideas that they are talking about that have shades of difference between the various candidates, with the weaknesses of those candidates being elucidated in the primary process. Ideally, the thought is that you end up with the strongest candidate, who is our strongest Democrat, to go out and run and fight for the Democratic Party. And on top of that, any issue that that candidate is having, that issue gets solved or dealt with, or at the very least brought up in the primary process before you get to the general election where the American public is hearing it for the first time. The reason they use the term October surprise is because it is a surprise. There's not enough time for the public to kind of digest it before the election happens. And so the drama that is taking place when the surprise is released is still going on at the time when the election is being held. So it's on the forefront of people's minds. All things being equal, you want that stuff out and digested before you get to the point of running into an election. So Harris and her team is not entirely wrong on this front, that all things being equal, Joe Biden did her no favors by staying in the race and failing in the way that he did. The other argument that they make is that the Biden's economy was not that great. So it was almost like she was digging herself out of a hole. So he was not necessarily cognitively there. They basically hid the fact that he was not altogether there. The economy was not that great. So regardless of how it looked on paper, in real terms, people were suffering, people were feeling pain, and Kamala Harris wasn't able to unwed herself from that. So they're arguing that he also had to dig herself out of a hole. This is the article from Axios, right here. One Democrat familiar with the White House dynamic pointed a finger at Mike Donnellan and Steve Ricchetti, Biden's top political aides. Mike and Steve will have a lot to answer for, having him run for re-election, the 80-year-old. This is the first point I made. One person involved with the Harris team told Axios the 170 days Harris campaign was nearly flawless. The Biden campaign that preceded it was the opposite. Again, this gets to Joy-Ann Reid's point. This was a flawless and historic campaign. We did nothing wrong. We did it without flaw. We had Swifties and we had Queen Latifah. God damn it, we should have won this campaign. The issue is Joe Biden. That's what they're saying. They take no responsibility at all. Let's keep going. Another person involved in the vice president's campaign, quote, "We did what we could. I think the odds against us were insurmountable," referring to Biden's low approval ratings and his late exit from the disastrous June debate that raised questions about his mental fitness. And here's another one. In an implicit criticism of Biden's team, top Harris aide David Plouffe posted on X that their campaign had dug out of a deep hole. He later deleted that tweet. So their argument is that Joe Biden was so bad that we were digging out of a hole. And so we ran a flawless campaign. And despite the fact we ran a flawless campaign, the hole was so deep that we had to dig out of that it was utterly and entirely an insurmountable challenge. That's what they're arguing. This is the Joy-Ann Reid argument, right? That all things being equal, we didn't do anything wrong. We were perfect. No, the issue was pretty much everybody and everything else that was against us. Okay, that's an hypothesis. Again, I don't share that hypothesis, even though they are not entirely wrong, that Joe Biden didn't necessarily put them in the best of shape. But again, as I pointed out the first time around, this idea that if Joe Biden doesn't run again, that it would automatically be Kamala, it's nonsense. Kamala would have had to run through a primary. So even if they go with the notion that, okay, well, Joe Biden steps down, Kamala Harris might have lost. Newsom might have won the primary. Who the hell knows? I'm pointing out that if she had to run through a primary process, the first time she ran through a primary process did not turn all that well for Kamala Harris. And it is very possible if she ran the primary in a similar way that she ran her presidential race, she might not have made it through the primary. Truth be told, the only sure way that we know that Kamala Harris would have been in the position that she was in is if it turned out exactly the way it turned out right now. In fact, even if they would have had a mini primary at the DNC, it is very possible that somebody other than Kamala Harris would have been chosen in that mini primary. So I understand their feelings about this. But truth be told, the only chance that Kamala Harris had to run for the presidency of the United States would be for this to turn out exactly the way it turned out, where Joe Biden flamed out and she had to take over the position at the last minute. Any other situation doesn't allow her as a guarantee to run for president. Just saying. The Biden administration shot back and pointed out, they said, you had $1 billion in loss. You had $1 billion in loss. So right here, responding to the criticism of Donald and Ricchetti of Biden NATO Axios, there's a wide range of advisors Biden consulted about the campaign who agreed on the merits of running, like the party did after the midterm wins for a new president in over 60 years. No one has the president do anything. Basically, they didn't force him. He wanted to run. Here's another one. A former Biden staffer dismissed the Harris team's criticism as making excuses for the vice president's failures. How do you spend $1 billion and not win? What the fuck? You had $1.6 billion. How do you not win that? What the fuck? How are you blaming us for this? And again, good point, right? Here's the thing though. If you want to be generous to Joe Biden, it may not be a power issue that he ran again. If you think back to before the debate, before that cataclysmically apocalyptic debate, where Joe Biden screamed that he beat Medicare at the end of the first question that he was asked. All right. A week before that debate, it was understood in basic political lexicon, meaning it was just understood, almost like breath to air, that Kamala Harris was unelectable. Kamala Harris wasn't all that much liked. From the standpoint of public approval rating, she was very low in the administration. And if you are Joe Biden, and if you actually want to win the White House, even if you just want to win it from the standpoint of being a Democrat, she would not have been the choice to run because you don't believe, nor did anybody in your administration believe, that she could win. We are looking back on this with hindsight, but I'm pointing out that at the time, the belief was that Harris couldn't win and that Joe Biden was fundamentally the stronger candidate. Part of that was because they were hiding the fact that Joe Biden was out of his goddamn mind. Part of it was that. But I'm just pointing out that if you're Joe Biden and you don't believe she can win, then you run because you believe your chances are better off. It was only after the debate when it became very clear that Joe Biden couldn't carry the burden that Joe Biden flamed out. Harris gets into the race. All right. Now, Harris' argument is that she ran a perfect campaign, that this was fundamentally impossible for her to win it. The odds were insurmountable. She only had 107 days. And, she ran a flawless and perfect campaign, like Joy-Ann Reid said. And so, there was nothing to be done. Nobody could have won it under the level of misogynism and racism that Kamala Harris had to endure. That's their argument. It was flawless. Problem with that argument is this. You could pull up the polling. If you notice, when Joe Biden got out the race, Trump was up at first. But look at what happened. It inverted. it inverted. Harris was given the benefit of the doubt by the American public. It wasn't about her being black. It wasn't about her being any of that stuff. In fact, I would argue that stuff was a benefit to her in the very beginning. They looked at her and they said, we want something different. Keep in mind, 80 to 72% of the American public said they were either angry or greatly dissatisfied with the direction the country was going. All right, Joe Biden was the person that was running that country. Again, okay. They believed that they were digging out of a hole. Let's accept that for the moment, that they were digging out of a hole because Joe Biden was so unpopular. Okay. Harris gets into the race. Her polling spikes. Because what people look at her and they say, okay, she's different. She's not what Joe Biden was. She's younger. She's a woman. She's a person of color. She's fundamentally different. Extemporaneously so. Meaning I can look at her and tell she is fundamentally different than Joe Biden. The polling pops up and remains up the entire race. From a national level, she was in the lead. In states, it was going back and forth. But I'm pointing out that it's not like she came into the race fundamentally behind in the race. For the longest time, she wasn't even doing interviews. They didn't even need her to do interviews. In fact, they were arguing she doesn't need policy to win this race. Kamala Harris fell off of a cliff at the end. This is October 19th. It's downhill from there. And you get Trump to take the lead for the first time. I hope you get the point that I'm making. I accept that Kamala Harris had certain disadvantages when she first got into the race because of it. Again, it's very possible that Kamala Harris wouldn't have been the candidate in any other situation. But put that to the side. I accept she had disadvantages when she first got into the race. That is a true statement. By the same token, those disadvantages were clearly not insurmountable. Kamala Harris made mistakes. Spending your time screaming about Trump without articulating what you are, what you want to do in that office, not having a theme, not having something that you're going to give to the American public, as opposed to, this is a campaign about joy. Okay, nobody knows what that means. All things being equal, you needed to be able to explain to people and to disambiguate yourself from Joe Biden. Harris, when she went from place A to place B and they asked her, what would you have done differently? Harris' response is, I can't think of anything. And not just not think of anything, I was in the room with Joe Biden when he was making the big decisions. And the reason she did that was obvious. She didn't have anything else to draw on to push up her bona fides, meaning I have bona fides in regards to foreign policy and domestic policy. So her thing was the decisions that Joe Biden made, I was in the room, I was right there with him as he was making those decisions. Okay, she goes on Colbert. What would you do differently? I can't think of anything that I would do differently per se. And all of the policies that she put out could have easily fit within the context of the Biden administration. All right, so the American public, where 72% are either angry at the direction of the country or greatly dissatisfied with the direction of the country, she has just told the overwhelming majority of the American public that A, I can't think of anything differently that I would have done. B, I can't think of anything differently that I would do. And despite being a new way forward, I seem to be same old, same old. She contradicted the very thesis of her campaign. Trump brought up the economy. Trump brought up, let's stop these wars. Trump, he was incoherent. He was all over the place, but every so often he would hit on immigration and he would hit on stuff that people cared about. Kamala Harris's campaign spent the majority of her time screaming at Donald Trump. And everything that came up, it was something about Trump. He's a fascist, he's a racist, he's a Nazi, he's a blah, 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 blah. Donald Trump's main argument at the very end was basically, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And if the answer is no, then you need to change horses. It's not about whether you like me or not. It's about your wallet and your economic condition. And it seems that people accepted the argument. When you look at the exit polling and you look at one of the questions of, were you moderately damaged during the inflation period, during the Joe Biden term? Were you severely damaged? The people who were severely damaged, I think it was like 72% voted for Trump. 50-something% of the moderately damaged voted for Trump. The people who were not damaged voted for Harris. The middle class ended up breaking for Trump. The people with the high degrees, meaning the advanced degrees, went for Harris. The people with the high incomes went for Harris. So you ended up with a middle class dynamic, A, and people who were mostly injured by this economy or didn't necessarily believe their financial situation was all that great, ended up going for Trump. So, you know, nobody told Kamala Harris to go running around with Liz Cheney. Nobody told her to do that. Nobody told her to ignore the issue in Gaza and basically run with the exact same line of reasoning and argument that Joe Biden made, not being able to disambiguate herself from him on that issue. Nobody told her to wed herself so closely to Joe Biden as she was running around the country, coming up with this kind of modest economy that she wanted to push forward. Nobody told her to put Mark Cuban, being a billionaire, as one of her main stomping ground people. Nobody told her to avoid Joe Rogan. Nobody told her to be robotic or inauthentic. I hope you get what I'm saying. All of these things were failings and faults. On some level, the ability to tell people what you want to do and to level with the American public would matter. It would matter greatly. I understand that you only had 107 days, but you had chances. Don't tell me that you ran a flawless campaign when I watched your campaign all the way through. To close this out, here's the last part. Another person with dynamics familiar, right here. Another person familiar with the dynamics said that one of Biden's team's they resent Harris for not using the president more during the campaign, even though he's unpopular and prone to gaffes. The Harris team benched Biden and they lost. So now people who represent Biden are saying maybe you shouldn't have benched him. Maybe you shouldn't have benched him. After all, as Simone Sanders pointed out, she lost Pennsylvania. And even though Biden might be gaffe prone, calling people trash or garbage would be one of those gaffes. There's a demographic that Kamala Harris needed that is possible that there's some fondness for Joe Biden in that state that they might have gotten. And considering she lost in a landslide, what could it have hurt, right? Yeah, they're going at each other. They're going at each other. I'll close it. Like I said, I didn't want this to be long. I was just fascinated by the fighting that's now taking place. Look, guys, I'll close this. If you guys dig the content, give it a like, share the video, subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit the notification bell. I run my show from Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m., so definitely join me if you find yourself up that morning doing whatever that you're doing. We have a really good show. We have a pretty good crowd that joins us. We have interviews and, of course, commentary. So, like, share, subscribe. You can always support the work through a super sticker, PayPal, or Patreon. All stickers are red, providing they are not racist, sexist, or bigoted. I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe. I'm sorry, I was reading the comments. Have a good one, guys. I'll see you a little bit later.